You see, when it comes to video games, most AAA games can kind of feel a little bit corporate. I'm not trying to say that they're all bad or anything like that, but there's not exactly a directorial style with all of them, if you know what I mean. But Sakurai always leaves his fingerprint on every single game he works on. From the menus his wife designs to the addictive mechanics that all these games seem to have, but I also think that there's a secret sauce that only he can bring to game development. And that secret sauce is what I'm going to figure out today. I'm going to go through the games he developed and see if he really deserves a spot at the top of the industry. I don't think there's any game more important than Smash Bros to understanding Sakurai's secret sauce. And that's because every single decision in this game is designed to teach the player about the foundational mechanics of fighting games, but also being able to still be fun even if you don't like fighting games at all. And I think that's really accomplished through what Sakurai himself calls game essence. According to Sakurai, game essence is when a game has a system of risk and reward that encourages players to kind of have a push and pull relationship between them and the obstacles. Both of these concepts can apply to basically any genre, but in Smash Bros, risk and reward looks like this. Regular punch attacks are quicker and have less end frames, but they do less damage, while smash attacks do more damage but take longer to execute and thus leave you more open to attack. Riskier moves have a chance to do more damage, thus increasing the reward. At its core, it's not that different from your typical fighting game. However, Smash sets itself apart by trading complicated fighting combos with directional inputs that anyone can pick up. And another unique thing to Smash is that it trades off regular health bars with percentages, meaning that the goal is always a little bit different. You may be at 100% damage, but that doesn't mean you're going to get knocked off immediately. I think that leads to a little bit more unpredictability, which actually makes it a lot more fun for beginners. And getting knocked off is not the end of the game, because Smash Bros has stocks, meaning players have to knock each other off 2, 3, 4 times, however many the players decide to go with. And I think it provides a great push and pull because players are now focusing on how much health and stocks they have and how much health and stocks their opponent has. And all of these mechanics that Smash Bros has provides a lot of game essence. However, Sakurai warns that there is one catch with game essence. Essentially, the more game essence a game has, the lower its broad appeal actually is. Which is why typically fighting games in general actually have a ton of game essence. There's a lot of complicated fighting systems, but their broad appeal is a lot lower because there's too much of it. So Smash Bros, like I said, is about streamlining that experience. And I think that's why Smash Bros features things like stage hazards, items, and kind of a little bit of randomness, because it means that new players will have something to be able to get the edge on a more experienced player. And I think that's what's incredible about Sakurai, is that you can find beginner-friendly game design in every single game he's directed, even his first one, Kirby's Dream Land. One thing that will help identify Sakurai's secret sauce is looking at how he approaches designing for beginners. Earlier I mentioned that having more game essence decreases his broad appeal. This presents a real problem when designing for beginners. You know, first of all, how do you define a beginner in the first place? Is it someone who's new to video games? Is it someone who's new to the genre? Or is it someone who's not particularly skilled? Don't point that at me. But in a lot of ways, I think that designing for a beginner is really designing for someone who isn't particularly skilled at something. It can be easy to take for granted, but I think a lot of video game logic only makes sense if you regularly play video games. And so I think the key to designing for beginners is making it harder for them to fail. But you have to be really careful. If you remove too much risk, it's really not that fun anymore. Failure is a very real part about video games, and being able to overcome it is part of the fun. So with that in mind, a lot of the decisions in Kirby start to make a lot of sense. Kirby can fly, which makes pits a non-issue. Enemies take away only a notch of health rather than just taking your power up away. And Kirby can inhale and use enemies as a projectile, providing players with a ranged attack. And all of these decisions make it so that Kirby's Dream Land is a game that any beginner can pick up and have fun right away. But I also think the game has enough charm that an experienced player can still have a lot of fun. So despite pits no longer being a major issue, there are enough enemies on the screen that the player still has to kind of navigate around them strategically. There's also fun cutscenes between zones, so players are kind of encouraged to see what's going to happen next. But that's the thing, designing for beginners is not something that Sakurai exclusively does. It's just something that he does well. But I think this next game will get us a little closer to discovering what makes Sakurai games so great. There are two major things that this game accomplished: simultaneous multiplayer and a style of game design that Sakurai calls Omnibus. Simultaneous multiplayer is such a huge accomplishment for this game because a lot of games around this era were simply turn-based, meaning only one player could play at a time. But Miyamoto, Bowser Jr.'s mom and Sakurai's coworker, the guy who created Mario, no big deal, he was the one who actually pushed to have simultaneous multiplayer in this game. And it's implemented really well here, and I think this is just another good example of how Sakurai really focuses on the player experience. So in Kirby Superstar, the camera only follows the main player. If the secondary player happens to wander off too far, they'll simply be teleported back into the main screen. The solution seems really simple, but this is something him and his team had to figure out from scratch, which I think is really impressive. And that's the thing about multiplayer, is that it kind of became such a core pillar of Sakurai's games going forward. Almost every single game he's directed after this point had some aspect of multiplayer, or multiplayer was the main focal point of the game. And that's the other thing with multiplayer. It just so happens to work really well with omnibus game design. So if you don't know what Omnibus means, it means that you take essentially the core gameplay loop of the game and you extrapolate the kind of core gameplay loop and then segment it into a bunch of different modes that the player can choose what experience they want to take part in. And this style of game design came from Sakurai's desire to create a game that wouldn't take that long to beat. So each of the modes in this game feel like a smaller collection of games built on Kirby's core gameplay loop. And it works so well in multiplayer because players can choose what type of experience they want to partake in. Nothing feels worse when you're playing a multiplayer game and you're all having to play through segments that you don't want to play to get to the segment you want to get to. But I also think that the Omnibus game design system works a lot better when you have a push and pull system that's repeatable. Beating a level is great, but you don't really need to beat it more than a couple of times. But there is another game that is great for repeatability. Now, Brawl is a game with some questionable design decisions. But before I talk about tripping and mechanics like that, I want to talk about how the Omnibus format evolved with Brawl. Technically, every single Smash Bros. Game kind of features Omnibus game design, but since Smash Bros. Is a game that's designed around fighting your opponents over and over and over again, you kind of have infinite possibilities when designing modes like this. In later entries, you had Smash Run, you had the weird board game mode on the Wii U, you had World of Light with Ultimate. There's so many different modes and gameplay styles that you can create, and Brawl is what started it all, in my opinion. And this style works so well because you can basically play these over and over and over. It makes this Omnibus format work so much better in Smash. That's the thing, Brawl is a bit of the black sheep of the franchise, but I do think it's a really great example of how Sakurai thinks of a specific audience when designing a game. And honestly, in my opinion, I think a lot of the design decisions like tripping and the more casualization of the gameplay loop came as a result of the Wii's target audience, casuals. And when you frame it like that, Brawl's decisions start to make a little more sense in my opinion. And the Wii controller really wasn't the best fit for a fighting game, which I think is why the gameplay's a little slower. And I think that's why tripping and RNG is much more prevalent in this game. And that's the thing with randomness, is that it can level the experience between a beginner and an experienced player, even if it can feel unfair sometimes. Randomness in some ways I think can create strategies, and I think it does create a different kind of push and pull, because you may have a plan and that plan falls apart because of RNG, and then you have to now adapt, create a new strategy on the fly. But it works better for games like Mario Party than it does for fighting games. All of this to say is that the target audience of this game, casuals, didn't always mesh well with hardcore fans of the series. But this is the second highest selling Smash game. Not that sales or anything, but if you're a AAA developer, you can't make more games if your games don't sell. Now, randomness might not have been implemented the best here, but I think this next game is a much better implementation of RNG. So just like Smash and Kirby Superstar, Air Ride is an omnibus game design centered around the core gameplay loop of racing. And I think the push and pull of this game comes from the unique way this game handles drifting. To succeed in races, players need to first squeeze Kirby to build up energy and then release that energy to get a boost forward. And all three gameplay modes were built around that design. But I think the mode that makes this really special is City Trial. In this mode, players have 5 minutes to gather stat increases for their machines, and when time runs out, they'll compete in a random minigame. As they play through City Trial, sudden random events will happen, usually providing the player with a risk, but then rewarding them if they overcome it. RNG and randomness are built into design of City Trial, and since it doesn't have a pre-established bias, I think people were more open to randomness in this game. Because of this decision, hardcore players may not resonate with this game quite as much, but it opens up the possibilities for a gameplay experience that all types of players would like. Yeah, you may not have the tournaments, but I do think it's something that can open up and make gaming accessible for everyone. And another thing with accessibility is that this game features a one-button control scheme, designed so beginners can focus on the objectives of the game mode rather than having to learn a complicated control scheme. And that's what's great about Sakurai as a director. When something works in one game, it carries over to the other. And if something doesn't work in one game, well, you haven't seen tripping come back since Brawl, have you? So I've covered a lot about Sakurai's game design, from Omnibus to designing for beginners, but I really want to get to the heart of what Sakurai's secret sauce is. What really makes this game so great? And I think these next couple of games really showcase why I think he deserves to be at the top. Kid Icarus Uprising is really interesting to me because of the way it handles narrative exposition. Narrative in games is one of those things that's really difficult to balance. On one hand, you have some players who really love deep stories and want to watch cutscenes and listen to all the dialogue, and the other side, you have players who don't want any of that and just want to get to the action. This is a problem because those are opposite types of players. And in a lot of ways, designing for this solution is the same problem that's being solved with designing for beginners and experts. So just like Smash Bros. Added items and simplified fighting game controls, Kid Icarus Uprising handles narrative exposition by having gameplay and story unfold at the exact same time. And that works great for the 3DS's dual screen nature. The top screen is reserved for gameplay, while the bottom screen unplays a cutscene or story that happens while the player is playing. And because of this, unless there's a cutscene, which there's a small amount of them in this game, almost all of the story unfolds through gameplay, which is really, really cool. That is Sakurai's secret sauce. Figuring out a problem that players have and finding a solution through game design. And this isn't the only problem that this game solved. This next one is what inspired this whole video. Uprising featured a mechanic known as the Fiend's Cauldron, which is basically a scale where players can choose which difficulty they want to play. The genius of this decision, however, is that it's dynamic. It's not picking a difficulty option of easy, medium, hard. It's a scale from 0 to 9. And this allows players to dynamically choose what difficulty they want to play. And when they die, the system will automatically lower it so that players can have an easier time and keep progressing forward. No player gets stuck just because they chose to play on hard. And I think the system is also genius because it adds game essence. Increasing the difficulty requires spending points, which means that overcoming the difficulty is a massive reward for the risk that the player is taking by putting points into the system. This system obviously isn't perfect, of course. If you want to 100% this game, it essentially means you need to do a perfect 100% deathless run. But I think this is a great system by making the game more accessible for players. So if you're someone who has a disability or can't play the game very well, if you put the game on 0, the game is extremely easy, which means that you get to experience the story without having to have the struggle of playing the game. And that philosophy of making gaming more accessible is really what inspired the creation of Smash Bros in the first place. You see, Sakurai was inspired to make a more accessible game after playing King of Fighters in the arcade. He was playing against someone and he ended up just absolutely dominating them. But there was no satisfaction in his victory once he realized he was playing against an absolute complete beginner. And that skill gap is the exact problem he solved with Smash Bros. And when you combine that philosophy with the detail-oriented mindset that Sakurai has, you get two of the greatest games ever made. And while obviously one is more preferred for competitive play, I think both of these games actually have a lot in common. Both of these games are major upgrades to their previous predecessors. Both of them featured a completely overhauled fighter balance. And both of them became cultural phenomenons. Obviously, a little bit of surface level observation, there's a lot of differences between both of them, but I don't think you get games with that impact and that care without a lot of experience and dedication to game design. And they're both played by people of all skill levels, making them perfect party games and competitive games. And starting with the original Kirby all the way up to Smash Ultimate and Kirby Air Riders, you have games that are difficult to master but easy to pick up. And every single one of Sakurai's games has simple controls and deep mechanics, and they solve problems through game design. That is Sakurai's secret sauce, and that is why I think he deserves to be up there with the greats.
Video complete!